Chapter 18. The caretaker was dozing on his favorite bench in the shade of the zapote tree. That's all he had been doing for the past 2 days. He no longer swept the patios or raked the leaves outside, but instead sat for hours on that bench, dozing or staring into the distance, as if he had a secret understanding with something that only he could see. Everything had changed in the house. Did I do wrong to come see them? I asked myself incessantly. I felt, as usual, guilty and defensive, and all I did was to sleep uninterrupted for hours on end. When awake, however, I was disturbingly aware that nothing was the same. Aimlessly, I wandered about the house, but it was to no avail. Something seemed to have fled from the house. The caretaker's long and loud sigh intruded on my thoughts. Unable to contain my anxiety any longer, I pushed my book aside, rose to my feet, and covered the short distance between us. "Won't you rake and burn some leaves today?" I asked. He looked up, startled, but did not answer. He was wearing sunglasses. I couldn't see the expression in his eyes through the dark lenses. I didn't know whether to stay or to leave or to wait for his reply. Afraid he might doze off again, I asked in a loud, impatient tone, "Is there a reason why you aren't raking and burning leaves any longer?" He parried my question with one of his own. "Have you seen or heard a leaf fall for the past 2 days?" His eyes seemed to drill through me as he lifted his glasses. "No," I said. It was the seriousness of his tone and demeanor, rather than his statement, which I found ridiculous, that compelled me to answer. He beckoned me to sit beside him on the bench. Leaning close to me, he whispered in my ear, "These trees know exactly when to let go of their leaves." He glanced all around him, as if he were afraid we might be overheard, then added in that same confidential whisper, "And now the trees know that there's no need for their leaves to fall." "Leaves wilt and fall regardless of anything," I pronounced pompously. "It's a law of nature." "These trees are utterly capricious," he maintained stubbornly. "They have a mind of their own. They don't follow the laws of nature." "What has prompted the trees not to drop any leaves?" I asked, trying to keep an earnest expression. "That's a good question," he mused, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "I'm afraid I don't know the answer yet. The trees haven't told me." He smiled at me inanely and added, "I've already told you, these trees are temperamental." Before I had a chance to retort, he asked out of the blue, "Did you make yourself your lunch?" His abrupt change of subject took me by surprise. "I did," I admitted, then hesitated for a moment. An almost defiant mood took hold of me. I don't care all that much about food. I'm quite used to eating the same food day in and day out. If it weren't for the fact that I get pimples, I would live on chocolates and nuts. Throwing all caution to the winds, I began to complain. I told the caretaker that I wished the women would talk to me. I would appreciate if they'd let me know what is going on. Anxiety is taking its toll on me. After I had said all I wanted to say, I felt much better, much relieved. Is it true that they are leaving forever? I asked. They have already left forever, the caretaker said. Seeing my uncomprehended expression, he added, But you knew that, didn't you? You're just making conversation with me, aren't you? Before I had a chance to recover from my shock, he asked me in a genuinely puzzled tone, Why should this be shocking to you? He paused for a moment, as if giving me time to think, then answered the question himself. Ah, I've got it. You are furious because they took Isidoro Baltazar with them. He patted me repeatedly on my back, as though to emphasize each word. His gaze told me that he didn't care if I gave in to either anger or tears. To know that I had no audience gave me an instantaneous sense of equanimity. I didn't know that, I murmured. I swear I didn't know it. I stared at him in mute despair. I felt all the blood drain from my face. My knees ached. My chest was so tight I couldn't breathe. Knowing that I was about to faint, I held onto the bench with both hands. I heard the caretaker's voice like a distant sound. No one knows if he'll ever come back. Not even I know that. Leaning toward me, he added, My personal opinion is that he has gone with them temporarily, but he'll come back. If not right away, someday. That's my opinion. I searched his eyes, wondering whether he was mocking me. His cheerful face radiated sheer goodwill and honesty, and his eyes were as guileless as a child's. However, when he returns, he won't be Isidoro Baltazar anymore, the caretaker warned me. The Isidoro Baltazar you knew, I think, is already gone. And do you know what's the saddest part? He paused, then answered his own question. You took him so for granted that you didn't even thank him for all his care, his help, his affection for you. Our great tragedy is to be buffoons, oblivious to anything else except our buffoonery. I was too devastated to say a word. Abruptly, the caretaker rose to his feet. Without another word, as if he were too embarrassed to stay with me, he walked toward the path that led to the other house. You can't just leave me here by myself, I shouted after him. He turned, waved at me, and then began to laugh. It was a loud, joyful sound that raised echoes across the chaparral. He waved once again, then vanished, as if the bushes had swallowed him. Incapable of following him, I waited for him to return or to appear suddenly in front of me and scare me half to death. I was almost embracing myself for a fright I intuited it in my body more than I anticipated in my mind. As it happened before, I didn't see or hear Esperanza approach, but I sensed her presence. I turned around, and there she was, sitting on the bench under the sapote tree. I became elated just watching her. I thought I was never going to see you again, I sighed. I had nearly resigned myself to it. I thought you were gone. Goodness gracious, she chided me in mock consternation. Are you really Zulika? I blurted out. Not a chance, she retorted. I am Esperanza. What are you doing? Driving yourself nuts with questions no one can answer? Never in my life had I been so close to a total breakdown as that moment. I felt that my mind was not going to take in all that pressure. I was going to be ripped apart by my anguish and turmoil. Brace yourself, girl, Esperanza said harshly. The worst is yet to come, but we can't spare you. To stop the pressure now, because you're about to go bonkers, is unthinkable to sorcerers. It's your challenge to be tested today. You either live or you die. And I don't mean this metaphorically. I'll never see Isidora Baltazar? I asked, hardly able to speak through my tears. I can't lie to you to spare your feelings. No, he'll never be back. Isidora Baltazar was only a moment of sorcery, a dream that passed after being dreamed. Isidora Baltazar, as the dream, is gone already. A small, almost wistful smile curved her lips. What I don't know yet, she continued, is if the man, the new Nawal, is gone forever as well. You understand, of course, that even if he returns, he won't be Isidora Baltazar. He'll be someone else you have to meet all over again. Would he be unknown to me? I asked, not quite sure whether I wanted to know. I don't know, my child, she said with the weariness of uncertainty. I simply don't know. I am a dream myself, and so is the new Nawal. Dreams like us are impermanent, for it is our impermanence that allows us to exist. Nothing holds us except the dream. Blinded by my tears, I could barely see her. To ease your pain, sink deeper into yourself, she said softly. Sit up with your knees raised and grab your ankles with crossed arms. Right ankle with the left hand. Put your head on your knees and let the sadness go. Let the earth soothe your pain. Let the earth's healing force come to you. I sat on the ground in exactly the manner she prescribed. Within moments, my sadness vanished. A deep, bodily sensation of well-being replaced my anguish. I lost sight of myself in any context except the context of the moment at hand. Without my subjective memory, I had no pain. Esperanza patted the place beside her on the bench. As soon as I was seated, she took my hand in hers and rubbed it for an instant, as if she were massaging it, then said that it was quite a fleshy hand for being so bony. She turned the palm up and studied it intently. She didn't say a word, but gently curled my hand into a fist. We sat in silence for a long time. It was late afternoon. Nothing could be heard but the rhythmic sound of leaves moved by the breeze. As I stared at her, a most uncanny certainty possessed me. I knew that Esperanza and I had already talked at length about my coming to the witch's house and the sorcerer's departure. What is it with me, Esperanza? I asked. Am I dreaming? Well, she began slowly. There was a gleam in her eyes as she proposed I test the dream. Sit on the ground and test it. I did. All I felt was the coldness of the rock I had sat on. No feeling was sent back to me. I'm not dreaming, I asserted. Then why do I feel that we've already talked? I searched her face to see if I could find a clue to my dilemma stamped on her features. This is the first time I've seen you since my arrival, but I feel we've been together every day. I mumbled, more to myself than to be heard. It's been 7 days now. It's been much longer. But you must resolve this puzzle yourself, with minimal help, Esperanza said. I nodded in agreement. There was so much I wanted to ask, but I knew and accepted that it would be useless to talk. I knew without knowing how I knew it that we had already covered all my questions. I was saturated with answers. Esperanza regarded me thoughtfully, as if she doubted my realization. Then, very slowly, enunciating her words carefully, she said, I want you to know that the awareness you have gotten here, no matter how deep and permanent it may seem to you, is only temporary. You'll get back to your nonsense soon enough. That's our women's fate, to be especially difficult. I think you're wrong, I protested. You don't know me at all. It's precisely because I know you that I am saying this. She paused for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was harsh and serious. Women are very cagey. Remember, being reared to be a servant makes you extremely shifty and clever. Her explosive, resonant laughter erased any desire I might have had to protest. The best thing you can do is to not say anything, she declared. Taking my hand, she pulled me up and suggested that we go to the small house for a long, much-needed talk. We didn't go inside the house, but sat down on a bench by the front door. Silently, we just sat there for nearly an hour. Then Esperanza turned toward me. She didn't seem to see me. In fact, I wondered if she had forgotten that I had come with her and was sitting beside her. Without acknowledging my presence, she stood up and moved a few steps away from me and gazed at the other house, nestled among a clump of trees. It was quite a while before she said, I'm going far. I couldn't tell whether it was hope, excitement, or apprehension that gave me a strangely sickening sensation in the pit of my stomach. I knew that she wasn't referring to distance in terms of miles, but in terms of other worlds. I don't care how far we're going, I said. It was a bravado I was far from feeling. I desperately wished to know, but didn't dare ask, what would be at the end of our journey. Esperanza smiled and opened her arms wide, as if to embrace the setting sun. The sky in the west was a fiery red. The distant mountains, a shadowy purple. A light breeze swept through the trees. The leaves shimmered and rustled A silent hour went by, and then all was still. The spell of twilight immobilized everything around us. Every sound and movement ceased. The contours of bushes, trees, and hills were so precisely defined, they appeared to have been etched against the sky. I moved closer to Esperanza as the shadows crawled up on us and blackened the sky. The sight of the other silent house, with its lights twinkling like glowworms in the dark, aroused some deeply buried emotion within me. It wasn't connected to any particular feeling of the moment, but to a vaguely sad, nostalgic memory buried in my childhood. I must have been totally engrossed in my reveries. Suddenly, I found myself walking alongside Esperanza. My tiredness, my former anxiety, had all vanished. Filled with an overwhelming sense of vigor, I walked in a kind of ecstasy, a silent happiness. My feet drawn forward, but not by my volition alone. The path we were walking on ended abruptly. The ground rose, and trees stretched high above us. Huge boulders were scattered here and there. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of running water, like a soft, comforting chant. Sighing with sudden fatigue, I leaned against one of the boulders and wished that this was the end of our journey. "We haven't reached our destination yet," Esperanza shouted. She was already halfway up some rocks, and she moved with the agility of a goat. She didn't wait for me. She didn't even look back to see if I was following her. My short rest had robbed me of my last strength. Grasping for breath, I slipped repeatedly on the stones as I scrambled after her. Halfway up, the trail continued around a huge boulder. The dry and brittle vegetation gave way to luscious growth, dark in the early evening light. The air, too, was no longer the same. It was humid, and, for me, easier to breathe. Esperanza moved unerringly along a narrow path. It was full of shadows, full of silence and rustlings. She knew each of the night's mysterious sounds. She identified each of its pulsating croaks, cries, calls, and hisses. The path came to an end in front of some steps cut into the rock. The steps led to a concealed mound of stones. "Pick one," she ordered, "and put it in your pocket." Worn as smooth as pebbles in a brook, the stones all looked the same at first. Upon closer examination, however, I discovered that they were all different. Some were smooth and shiny. They appeared to have been polished in a tumbler. It took me quite some time until I found one I liked. It was heavy, yet it fit easily in my palm. Its light brown, bulky mass was wedge-shaped and crisscrossed by almost translucent, milky veins. Startled by a noise, I almost dropped the stone. "Someone is following us," I whispered. "Nobody is following us," Esperanza exclaimed, with a look halfway between amusement and incredulity. incredulity. Seeing me draw back behind a tree, she giggled softly and said that it was probably a toad jumping through the underbrush. I wanted to tell her that toads don't jump in the darkness, but I wasn't sure it was true. It surprised me that I hadn't just said it was the most absolute certainty, as was my habit. Something is wrong with me, Esperanza, I said in an alarmed tone of voice. I'm not myself. There's nothing wrong with you, dear, she assured me absent-mindedly. In fact, you are more yourself than ever. I feel strange. My voice trailed off. I had begun to see a pattern in what had been happening to me since the first time I arrived at the witch's house. It's very hard to teach something so unsubstantial as dreaming, Esperanza said. Especially to women. We are extremely coy and clever. After all, we've been slaves all our lives. We know how to precisely manipulate things when we don't want anything to upset what we have worked so hard to obtain, our status quo. Do you mean that men don't? They certainly do, but they are more overt. Women fight underhandedly. Their preferred fighting technique is the slave's maneuver, to turn the mind off. They hear without paying attention, and they look without seeing. She added that to instruct women was an accomplishment worthy of praise. We like the openness of your fighting, she went on. There is high hope for you. What we fear the most is the agreeable woman who doesn't mind the new and does everything you ask her to do, and then turns around and denounces you as soon as she gets tired or bored with the newness. I think I am beginning to understand, I mused uncertainly. Of course you have begun to understand. Her assertion was so comically triumphant, I had to laugh. You have even begun to understand what intent is. You mean I am beginning to be a sorceress? I asked. My whole body shook as I tried to suppress a fit of giggles. Since you arrived here, you've been dreaming awake on and off, Esperanza stated. That's why you fall asleep so much. There was no mockery, not even a trace of condensation in her smiling face. We walked in silence for a while. And then she said that the difference between a sorcerer and an ordinary person was that the former could enter into a state of dreaming awake at will. She tapped my arm repeatedly, as if to emphasize her point, and in a confidential tone added, and you are dreaming awake because, in order to help you hone your energy, we have created a bubble around you since the first night you arrived. She went on to say that from the moment they first met me, they had nicknamed me Fosforito, Little Match. You burn too fast and uselessly. She gestured for me to remain quiet and added that I didn't know how to focus my energy. It's deployed to protect and uphold the idea of yourself. Again, she motioned me to be silent and said that what we think is our personal self is, in actuality, only an idea. She claimed that the bulk of our energy is consumed in defending that idea. Esperanza's eyebrows lifted a little, an elated grin spreading across her face. To reach a point of detachment where the self is just an idea that can be changed at will is a true act of sorcery, and the most difficult of all, she explained. When the idea of the self retreats, sorcerers have the energy to align themselves with intent and be more than what we believe is normal. Women, because they have a womb, can focus their attention with great facility on something outside their dreams while dreaming, she explained. That's precisely what you have been doing all along, unbeknownst to yourself. That object becomes a bridge that connects you to intent. And what object do I use? There was a flicker of impatience in her eyes. Then she said that it was usually a window or a light or even the bed. You're so good at it. That's second nature with you, she assured me. That's why you have nightmares. I told you all this when you were in a deep state of dreaming awake. And you understood that as long as you refuse to focus your attention on any object prior to sleeping, you don't have bad dreams. You are cured, aren't you? She asked. My initial reaction, of course, was to contradict her. However, upon a moment's thought, I couldn't but agree with her. After my meeting with them in Sonora, I had been fairly free from nightmares. You'll never be really free from them as long as you persist in being yourself, she pronounced. What you should do, of course, is to exploit your dreaming talents deliberately and intelligently. That's why you're here. And the first lesson is that a woman must, through her womb, focus her attention on an object. Not an object from the dream itself, but an independent one. One from the world prior to the dream. Yet, it isn't the object that matters, she hastened to point out. What's important is the deliberate act of focusing on it at will, prior to the dream and while continuing the dream. She warned me that although it sounded simple enough, it was a formidable task that might take me years to accomplish. What normally happens is that one awakens the instant one focuses one's attention on the outside object, she said. What does it mean to use the womb? I interjected. And how is it done? You are a woman, Esperanza said softly. You know how to feel with your womb. I wanted to contradict her, to explain that I didn't know any such thing. Before I could do so, however, she went on to explain that in a woman, feelings originate in the womb. In men, she claimed, feelings originate in the brain. She poked me in the stomach and added Think about it. A woman is heartless, except with her brood, because her feelings are coming from her womb. In order to focus your attention with your womb, get an object and put it on your belly or rub it on your genitalia. She laughed uproariously at my look of dismay. Then, in between fits of laughter, chided me. I wasn't that bad. I could have said that you need to smear the object with your juices, but I didn't. Once you establish a deep familiarity with the object, she continued, her tone serious again, it'll always be there to serve you as a bridge. We walked in silence for a stretch. She was seemingly deep in thought. I was itching to say something, yet knew that I didn't have anything to say. When she finally spoke, her voice was stern, demanding. There is no more time for you to waste, she said. It's very natural that in our stupidity we screw things up. Sorcerers know this better than anyone else, but they also know that there are no second chances. You must learn control and discipline because you have no more leeway for mistakes. You screwed up, you know. You didn't even know that Isidora Baltazar had left. The ethereal dike that was holding the avalanche of feelings broke down. My memory was restored, and sadness took over me again. It became so intense that I didn't even notice I had sat and was sinking into the ground as if it were made out of sponge. Finally, the ground swallowed me. It was not a suffocating, claustrophobic experience because the sensation of sitting on the surface coexisted simultaneously with the awareness of being swallowed by the earth. A dual sensation that made me yell, "I'm dreaming now!" That loudly spoken announcement triggered something within me. A new landslide of different memories flooded in on top of me. I knew what was wrong with me. I had screwed up and had no energy to dream. Every night since my arrival, I had dreamt the same dream, which I had forgotten about until that very moment. I dreamt that all the women sorcerers came to my room and drilled me in the sorcerer's rationales. They told me, on and on, that dreaming is the secondary function of the womb, the primary being reproduction and whatever is related to it. They told me that dreaming is a natural function in women, a pure corollary of energy. Given enough energy, the body of a woman by itself will awake the womb's secondary functions, and the woman will dream inconceivable dreams. That needed energy, however, is like aid to an underdeveloped country. It never arrives. Something in the overall order of our social structures prevents that energy from being free so women can dream. Were that energy free, the women sorcerers told me, it would simply overthrow the civilized order of things. But women's great tragedy is that their social conscience completely dominates their individual conscience. Women fear being different and don't want to stray too far from the comforts of the known. The social pressures put upon them not to deviate are simply too overpowering. And rather than change, they acquiesce to what has been ordained. Women exist to be at service of man. Thus, they can never dream sorcery dreams, although they have the organic disposition for it. Womanhood has destroyed women's chances. Whether it be tinted with a religious or a scientific slant, it still brands women with the same seal. Their main function is to reproduce, and whether they have achieved a degree of political, social, or economic equality is ultimately immaterial. The women told me all this every night. The more I remembered and understood their words, the greater was my sorrow. My grief was no longer for me alone, but for all of us. A race of schizoids being trapped in a social order that has shackled us to our own incapacities. If we ever break free, it is only momentarily, a short-lived clarity, before we plunge, willingly or forced, back into darkness. "Stop this sentimental garbage," I heard a voice say. It was a man's voice. I looked up and saw the caretaker bending over, peering at me. "How did you get here?" I asked. I was perplexed and a little flustered. "You've been following us?" More than a question, it was an accusation. "Yes, I've been following you in particular." He leered at me. I searched his face. I didn't believe him. I knew he was poking fun at me. Yet I was neither annoyed nor frightened by the intense glint in his eyes. "Where's Esperanza?" I asked. She was nowhere in sight. "Where did she—" I stammered nervously, unable to get the words out. "She's around," he said, smiling. "Don't worry. I'm also your teacher. You are in good hands." Hesitantly, I put my hand in his. Effortlessly, he pulled me up to a flat boulder overlooking a large, oval-shaped pool of water. It was fed by a murmuring stream trickling from somewhere in the darkness. "And now, take off your clothes," he said. "It's time for your cosmic bath." "My what?" Certain that he was joking, I began to laugh. But he was serious. He tapped me repeatedly on the arm, just like Esperanza did, and urged me to take off my clothes. Before I knew what he was doing, he had already untied the laces on my sneakers. "We don't have all that much time," he admonished, then pressed me to get on with it. The look he gave me was cold, clinical, impersonal. I might have been the toad Esperanza had claimed was jumping around. The sheer idea of getting into that dark, cold water, infested, no doubt, with all sorts of slimy creatures, was appalling to me. Eager to put an end to that preposterous situation, I sidled down the boulder and stuck my toes into the water. "I don't feel a thing," I cried out, shrinking back in horror. "What's going on? This is not water." "Don't be childish," the caretaker scolded me. "Of course it's water. You just don't feel it, that's all." I opened my mouth to let out an imprecation, but controlled myself in time. My horror had vanished. "Why don't I feel the water?" I asked, trying hard to gain time. Although I knew that stalling for time was a useless affair, for I had no doubt that I was going to end up in the water, whether I felt the water or not. However, I had no intention of giving in gracefully. Is this waterless water? Is this waterless water some kind of a purification liquid? I asked. After a long silence, charged with menacing possibilities, he said that I might call it a purification liquid. However, I should warn you that there isn't a ritual capable of purifying anyone, he emphasized. Purification has to come from within. It's a private and lonely struggle. Then why do you want me to get into this water, which is slimy, even if I don't feel it? I said with all the force I could invoke. His lips twitched as if he were about to laugh. But seemingly reluctant to give in, his face grew grave again, and he said, "I'm going to dive into that pool with you." And without any further hesitation, he completely undressed. He stood in front of me, barely 5 feet away, stark naked. In that strange light that was neither day or night, I could see with utter clarity every inch of his body. He didn't make bashful attempts to cover his nakedness. Quite the opposite. He seemed to be more than proud of his maleness and paraded it in front of me with defiant insolence. "Hurry up and take off your clothes," he urged me. "We don't have much time." "I'm not going to do that. It's insane," I protested. "You are going to do that. It's a decision you'll make all by yourself." He spoke without vehemence, without anger, yet with quiet determination. "Tonight, in this strange world, you will know that there is only one way to behave, the sorcerer's way." He stared at me with a curious mixture of compassion and amusement. With a grin that was meant to reassure me, but didn't, the caretaker said that jumping into the pool would jolt me. It would shift something within me. This shift will serve you at a later time to understand what we are and what we do. A fleeting smile lit up his face as he hastened to point out that jumping into the water would not give me the energy to dream awake on my own. He warned me that it would certainly take a long time to save and hone my energy, and that I might never succeed. "There are no guarantees in the sorcerer's world," he said. Then he conceded that jumping into the pool might shift my attention away from my everyday concerns, the concerns expected of a woman of my age, of my time. Is this a sacred pool? I asked. His brows shot up in obvious surprise. It's a sorcerer's pool, he explained, gazing at me steadily. He must have seen that my decision had been made, for he unfastened the watch around my wrist. The pool is neither holy nor evil. He shrugged his thin shoulders and fastened my watch around his own wrist. Now look at your watch, he ordered me. It's been yours for many years. Feel it on my wrist. He chuckled as he started to say something and decided against it. Well, go on, take off your clothes. I think I'll just wade in with my clothes on, I mumbled. Although I wasn't prudish, I somehow resisted the idea of standing naked in front of him. He pointed out that I would need dry clothes when I got out of the water. I don't want you to catch pneumonia. A wicked smile dawned in his eyes. This is real water, even though you don't feel it, he said. Reluctantly, I took off my jeans and shirt. Your panties too, he said. I walked around the grassy edge of the pool, wondering whether I should just dive in and get it over with, or whether I should get wet little by little, cupping water in my hands, letting it trickle down my legs, my arms, my stomach, and last over my heart, as I remembered old women doing in Venezuela before wading into the sea. Here I go, I cried out. But instead of jumping in, I turned to look at the caretaker. His immobility frightened me. He seemed to have turned into stone. So still and erect did he sit on the boulder. Only his eyes seemed to have life. They shone in a curiously compelling way, without any source of light to account for it. It astounded more than saddened me to see tears trickling down his cheeks. Without knowing why, I too began to weep silently. His tears made their way down, I thought, into my watch on his wrist. I felt the eerie weight of his conviction, and suddenly my fear and my indecision were gone, and I dove into the pool. The water was not slimy, but transparent, like silk, and green. I wasn't cold. As the caretaker had claimed, I didn't feel the water. In fact, I didn't feel anything. It was as if I were a disembodied awareness, swimming in the center of a pool of water that did feel liquid, but not wet. I noticed that light emanated from the depths of the water. I jumped up like a fish to gather impetus, then dove in search of the light. I came up for air. How deep is this pool? As deep as the center of the earth. Esperanza's voice was clear and loud. It carried such certainty that, just to be myself, I wanted to contradict her. But there was something uneasy in the air that stopped me. Some unnatural stillness some tension that was suddenly broken by a crisp, rustling sound all around us. A sort of warning whisper, a rushing, ominous warning that something was odd. Standing on the exact same spot where the caretaker had stood was Esperanza. She was stark naked. "Where's the caretaker?" I shouted in a panic-stricken voice. "I am the caretaker," she said. Convinced that those two were playing some horrendous trick on me, I propelled myself with one great side stroke toward the overhanging boulder Esperanza was standing on. "What's going on?" I demanded to know, in a voice that was but a whisper, for I could hardly breathe. Gesturing for me to remain still, she moved toward me with that boneless, uncoiling movement so characteristic of her. She craned her neck to look at me, then stepped closer and showed me my watch strapped around her wrist. "I am the caretaker," she repeated. I nodded automatically. But then, right there in front of me, instead of Esperanza, was the caretaker, naked as he had been before, pointing at my watch on his wrist. I didn't look at the watch. All my attention was focused on his sexual organs. I reached out to touch him, to see if perhaps he was a hermaphrodite. He wasn't. With my hand still probing, I felt, more than saw, his body fold into itself. And I was touching a woman's vagina. I parted the lips to make sure the penis was not hidden somewhere in there. "Esperanza!" My voice faded as something clamped around my neck. I was conscious of the water parting as something pulled me into the depths of the pool. I felt cold. It wasn't a physical coldness, but rather the awareness of the absence of warmth, of light, of sound. The absence of any human feeling in that world where that pool existed. I awoke to the faint sound of snoring. Zulika was sleeping beside me on a straw mat laid on the ground. She looked as beautiful as ever, young and strong, yet vulnerable. Unlike the other women sorcerers, in spite of the harmony and power she exuded. I watched her for a moment, then sat up as all the events of the night came flooding into my mind. I wanted to shake her awake and demand that she tell me what had happened. When I noticed that we were not by the pool up in the hills, but in the exact same spot where we had been sitting earlier, by the front door of the real witch's house. Wondering whether it had all been a dream, I gently shook her by the shoulder. "Ah, you finally woke up," she murmured sleepily. "What happened?" I asked. "You have to tell me everything." "Everything?" she repeated, yawning noisily. "Everything that happened at the pool," I snapped impatiently. Again she yawned, and then she giggled. Studying my watch, which was on her wrist, She said that something in me had shifted more than she had anticipated. The sorcerer's world has a natural barrier that dissuades timid souls, she explained. Sorcerers need tremendous strength to handle it. You see, it's populated by monsters, flying dragons, and demonic beings, which of course are nothing but impersonal energy. We, driven by our fears, make that impersonal energy into hellish creatures. But what about Esperanza and the caretaker? I interrupted her. I dreamt that both were really you. They are, she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. I've just told you. You shifted deeper than I anticipated and entered into what dreamers call dreaming in worlds other than this world. You and I were dreaming in a different world. That's why you didn't feel the water. That's the world where the Nahual Elias found all his inventions. In that world, I can be either a man or a woman. And just like the Nahual Elias brought his inventions to this world, I bring either Esperanza or the caretaker. Or rather, my impersonal energy does that. I couldn't put my thoughts or feelings into words. An incredible urge to run away, screaming, took hold of me. But I couldn't put it into action. My motor control was no longer a volitional matter with me. Trying to rise and scream, I collapsed on the ground. Zulika wasn't in the least concerned or moved by my condition. She went on talking as if she hadn't seen my knees give, as if I weren't lying sprawled on the ground like a rag doll. You're a good dreamer. After all, you've been dreaming with monsters all your life. Now it's time you acquired the energy to dream like sorcerers do, to dream about impersonal energy. I wanted to interrupt her, to tell her that there was nothing impersonal about my dream of Esperanza and the caretaker. That in fact, it was worse than the monsters of my nightmares. But I couldn't speak. Tonight, your watch brought you back from the deepest dream you ever had, Zulika continued. Indifferent to the weird sounds emerging from my throat. And you even have a rock to prove it. She came to where I lay open-mouthed, staring at her. She felt in my pocket. She was right. There it was, the rock I had picked from the pile of stones. Chapter 19. A loud, shattering noise woke me. I sat up in my hammock, peering into the darkness, and saw that the wooden panels covering the windows were down. A cold, sucking wind swirled up around me. Leaves rustled across the patio outside my room. The rustling grew, then abruptly faded to a gentle, swishing sound. A dim brightness seeped into the room like mist. It clung to the bare walls. "Nahual!" I cried out. For a moment, as if I were conjuring him up, Isidoro Baltazar stood at the foot of my hammock. He looked real, yet there was something undefined about him, like an image seen in water. I cleared my throat to speak, but only a faint croak escaped my lips as the image dissolved in the mist. Then the mist moved, restless and abrupt, like the wind outside. Too tense to sleep, I sat, wrapped in my blanket, pondering whether I had done the right thing to come to the witch's house, looking for the Nahual, Isidoro Baltazar. I didn't know anywhere else to go. I had patiently waited for 3 months. Then my anxiety had become so acute that it finally prompted me to act. One morning, 7 days ago, I had driven nonstop to the witch's house, and there had been no question in my mind then about whether I had proceeded correctly. Not even after I had to climb over the wall at the back of the house and let myself in through an unlocked window. However, after 7 days of waiting, my certainty had begun to falter. I jumped out of my hammock onto the tiled floor, landing hard on the heels of my bare feet. Shaking myself that way had always helped me dispel my uncertainties. It didn't work this time, and I lay down again in my hammock. If there is one thing I should have learned in the 3 years I had spent in the sorcerer's world, it is that sorcerer's decisions are final, and my decision had been to live and die in the sorcerer's world. Now it was time for me to prove it. An unearthly sounding laughter startled me out of my reveries. Eerily, it reverberated throughout the house. Then all was silent again. I waited tensely, but there was no other sound except that of dry leaves being pushed by the wind on the patio. They sounded like a faint, raspy whisper. Listening to that sound not only lulled me to sleep, but pulled me into the same dream I had been dreaming for the past 7 nights. I am standing in the Sonoran Desert. It is noon. The sun, a silvery disk so brilliant as to be almost invisible, has come to a halt in the middle of the sky. There is not a single sound, not a movement around. The tall saguaros, with their prickly arms reaching toward that immobile sun, stand like sentries guarding the silence and the stillness. The wind, as if it has followed me through the dream, begins to blow with tremendous force. It whistles between the branches of the mesquite trees and shakes them with systematic fury. Red dust devils well up in powdery swirls all around me. A flock of crows scatter like dots through the air, then fall to the ground a bit farther away, softly, like bits of black veil. As abruptly as it has begun, the wind dies down. I head toward the hills in the distance. It seems I walk for hours before I see a huge, dark shadow on the ground. I look up. A gigantic bird hangs in the air with outstretched wings, motionless, as though it were nailed to the sky. It is only when I gaze again at its dark shadow on the ground that I know that the bird is moving. Slowly, imperceptibly, its shadow glides ahead of me. Driven by some inexplicable urge, I try to catch up with the shadow. Regardless of how fast I run, the shadow moves farther and farther away from me. Dizzy with exhaustion, I stumble over my own feet and fall flat on the ground. As I rise to dust off my clothes, I discover the bird perched on a nearby boulder. Its head is slightly turned toward me, as though beckoning me. Cautiously, I approach it. It is enormous and tawny, with feathers that glisten like burnished copper. Its amber-colored eyes are hard and implacable, and as final as death itself. I step back as the bird opens its wide wings and takes off. It flies high up until it is only a dot in the sky. Yet its shadow on the ground is a straight, dark line that stretches into infinity and holds together the desert and the sky. Confident that if I summon the wind, I will catch up with the bird, I invoke an incantation. But there is no force, no power in my chant. My voice breaks into 1,000 whispers that are quickly absorbed by the silence. The desert regains its eerie calm. It begins to crumble at the edges, then slowly fades all around me. Gradually, I become conscious of my body lying in the hammock. I discerned, through a shifting haze, the book-lined walls of the room. Then I was fully awake, and the realization hit me, as it had hit me every time during the past week, that this had not been an ordinary dream, and that I knew what it meant. The Nahual, Mariano Aureliano, had once told me that sorcerers, when they talk among themselves, speak of sorcery as a bird. They call it the bird of freedom. They say that the bird of freedom only flies in a straight line and never comes around twice. They also say that it is the Nahual who lures the bird of freedom. It is he who entices the bird to shed its shadow on the warrior's path. Without that shadow, there is no direction. The meaning of my dream was that I had lost the bird of freedom. I had lost the Nahual, and without him, all hope and purpose. And what weighed the most on my heart was that the bird of freedom flew away so fast, it didn't give me time to thank them properly. Didn't give me time to express my endless admiration. I had assured the sorcerers all along that I never took their world or their persons for granted. But I did. In particular, Isidoro Baltazar's. He surely was going to be with me forever, I thought. Suddenly, they were gone, all of them, like puffs of air, like shooting stars, and they took Isidoro Baltazar with them. I had sat for weeks on end in my room, asking myself the same question. How can it be possible that they vanished like that? A meaningless, superfluous question, considering what I had experienced and witnessed in their world. All it revealed was my true nature, meek and doubting. For the sorcerers had told me for years that their ultimate purpose was to burn, to disappear, swallowed by the force of awareness. The old Nawal and his party of sorcerers were ready, but I didn't know it. They had been preparing themselves nearly all their lives for the ultimate audacity, to dream awake that they sneak past death, as we ordinarily know death to be, and cross over into the unknown, enhancing, without breaking, the unity of their total energy. My regret was most intense upon recalling how my usual doubting self would emerge when I least expected it. It was not that I didn't believe their stupendous, otherworldly, yet so practical aim and purpose. Rather, I would explain them away, integrate them, make them fit into the everyday world of common sense. Not quite, perhaps, but certainly coexisting with what was normal and familiar to me. The sorcerers certainly tried to prepare me to witness their definitive journey. That they would one day vanish was something I was almost aware of. But nothing could have prepared me for the anguish and despair that followed. I sunk into a well of sadness from which I knew I would never come out. That part was for me alone to deal with. Afraid I would only give in to more despair if I stayed a moment longer in my hammock, I got up and made breakfast. Or rather, I warmed up last night's leftovers. Tortillas, rice, and beans. My standard meal of the last 7 days. Except that for lunch, I would add a can of Norwegian sardines. I had found them at a grocery store in the nearest town. I had bought all the cans they had. The beans were also canned. I washed the dishes and mopped the floor. Then, with broom in hand, I went from room to room, looking for some new dirt, a spider web in some forgotten corner. From the day I had arrived, I had done nothing else but scrub floors, wash windows and walls, sweep patios and corridors. Cleaning tasks had always distracted me from my problems, had always given me solace. Not this time. Regardless of how eagerly I went about my chores, I couldn't still the anguish, the aching void within me. A quick rustling of leaves interrupted my cleaning chores. I went outside to look. There was a strong wind blowing through the trees. Its force startled me. I was ready to close the windows when the wind abruptly died out. A profound melancholy settled over the yard, over the bushes and trees, over the flower and vegetable patches. Even the bright purple bougainvillea hanging over the wall added to the sadness. I walked over to the Spanish colonial motif fountain, built into the middle of the yard, and knelt on the wide stone ledge. Absent-mindedly, I picked out the leaves and the blossoms that had fallen in the water. Then, bending over, I searched for my image on the smooth surface. Next to my face appeared the very beautiful, stark, and angular face of Florinda. Dumbfounded, I watched her reflection, mesmerized by her large, dark, luminous eyes, which contrasted dazzlingly with her braided white hair. Slowly, she smiled. I smiled back. "I didn't hear you come," I whispered, afraid that her image might vanish, afraid that she might be only a dream. She let her hand rest on my shoulder, then sat beside me on the stone ledge. "I'm going to be with you only for a moment," she said. "I'll come back later, though." I turned around and poured out all the anguish and despair that had accumulated in me. Florinda stared at me. Her face reflected an immeasurable sadness. There were sudden tears in her eyes, tears that were gone as fast as they had come. "Where is Isidoro Baltazar?" I asked her. I averted my face and gave free rein to my pent-up tears. It wasn't self-pity or even sorrow that made me weep, but a deep sense of failure, of guilt and loss. It was drowning me. Florinda had certainly warned me in the past about such feelings. "Tears are meaningless for sorcerers," she said in her deep, husky voice. "When you joined the sorcerer's world, you were made to understand that the designs of fate, no matter what they are merely challenges that a sorcerer must face without resentment or self-pity." She paused for a moment. Then, in her familiar, relentless manner, she repeated what she had said to me on previous occasions. "Isidoro Baltazar is no longer a man, but a Nawal. He may have accompanied the old Nawal, in which case he'll never return. But then, he may not have. But why did he?" My voice died away before I had asked the question. "I really don't know at this time," Florinda said, raising her hand to forestall my protest. "It is your challenge to rise above this. And as you know, challenges are not discussed or resented. Challenges are actively met. Sorcerers either succeed in meeting their challenges or they fail at it. And it doesn't really matter which, as long as they are in command." "How do you expect me to be in command when the sadness is killing me? Isidoro Baltazar is gone forever," I said resentfully, irked by the prosaicness of her feelings and attitudes. "Why don't you heed my suggestion and behave impeccably, regardless of your feelings?" she retorted sternly. Her temper was as quick as her brilliant smile. "How can I possibly do that? I know that if the Nawal is gone, the game is over. You don't need the Nawal to be an impeccable sorceress, she remarked. Your impeccability should lead you to him, even if he's no longer in the world. To live impeccably within your circumstances is your challenge. Whether you see Isidora Baltazar tomorrow, or in a year, or at the end of your life, should make no difference to you. Florinda turned her back to me. She was silent for a long time. When she faced me again, her face was calm and oddly bland, like a mask, as though she were making a great effort to control her emotions. There was something so sad about her eyes. It made me forget my own anguish. Let me tell you a story, young woman, she said, in an unusually harsh voice, as if her tone was meant to cancel the pain in her eyes. I didn't go with the Nawal Mariano Aureliano and his party, and neither did Zulika. Do you know why? Numb with anticipation and fear, I stared at her, open-mouthed. No, Florinda, I don't, I finally managed to say. We are here because we don't belong to that party of sorcerers, she said, her voice now low and soft. We do, but then we don't really. Our feelings are with another Nawal, the Nawal Julian, our teacher. The Nawal Mariano Aureliano is our cohort, and the Nawal Isidora Baltazar, our pupil. Like yourself, we've been left behind. You, because you were not ready to go with them. We, because we need more energy to take a greater jump and join, perhaps, another band of warriors, a much older band, the Nawal Julians. I could feel Florinda's aloneness and solitude, like a fine mist settling all around me. I barely dared to breathe, lest she stop talking. At great length, she told me about her teacher, the Nawal Julian, famous by all accounts. Her descriptions of him were compressed, yet so evocative, I could see him before my very eyes. The most dashing being that ever lived. Funny, sharp-witted, and fast-thinking. An incorrigible prankster. A storyteller. A magician who handled perception as a master baker handles dough. Kneading it into any shape or form without ever losing sight of it. To be with the Nawal Julian, Florinda assured me, was something unforgettable. She confessed that she loved him beyond words, beyond feelings, and so did Zulika. Florinda was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains, as if drawing strength from those sharp-edged peaks. When she spoke again, her voice was a barely audible whisper. The world of sorcerers is a world of solitariness, yet in it, love is forever. Like my love for the Nawal Julian. We move in the world of sorcerers all by ourselves, accounting only for our acts, our feelings, our impeccability. She nodded, as if to underline her words. I've no longer any feelings. Whatever I had went away with the Nawal Julian. All I have left is my sense of will, of duty, of purpose. Perhaps you and I are in the same boat. She said this so smoothly that it passed before I realized what she had said. I stared at her, and as always, I was dazzled by her splendid beauty and youthfulness, which the years had left bewitchingly intact. Not me, Florinda, I finally said. You had the Nawal Isidoro Baltazar and me, and all the other disciples I've heard about. I have nothing. I don't even have my old world. There was no self-pity in me, only a devastating knowledge that my life, as I had known it until now, had ended. The Nawal Isidoro Baltazar is mine by right of my power. I'll wait dutifully a bit longer, but if he's not here in this world anymore, neither am I. I know what to do. My voice trailed off as I realized that Florinda was no longer listening to me. She was absorbed in watching a small crow making its way toward us along the fountain ledge. That's Dionysus, I said, reaching into my pocket for his pieces of tortilla. I had none with me. I looked up at the marvelously clear sky. I had been so engrossed in my sadness, I hadn't noticed that it was already past noon, the time this little crow usually came for its food. That fellow is quite upset, Florinda laughed at the bird's outraged cause, and then, looking me in the eye, said, You and the crow are quite alike. You get easily upset, and you're both quite loud about it. I could barely contain myself from blurting out that the same could be said about her. Florinda chuckled, as though she knew the effort I was making not to weep. The crow had perched on my empty hand and stared at me sidelong with its shiny, pebble-like eyes. The bird opened its wings but didn't fly away. Its black feathers sparkled blue in the sun. I calmly told Florinda that the pressures of the sorcerer's world were unbearable. Nonsense, she chided, as if she were talking to a spoiled child. Look, we scared Dionysus away. Enraptured, she watched the crow circle over our heads. Then she fixed her attention back on me. I averted my face. I didn't know why, but there was nothing unkind in the gaze of those shiny dark eyes. They were calm and utterly indifferent, as she said, If you can't catch up with Isidoro Baltazar, then I and the rest of the sorcerers who taught you would have failed to impress you. We would have failed to challenge you. It's not a final loss for us, but it certainly will be a final loss for you. Seeing that I was about to weep again, she challenged me. Where is your impeccable purpose? What happened to all the things you've learned with us? What if I never catch up with Isidoro Baltazar? I asked tearfully. Can you go on living in the sorcerer's world if you don't make an effort to find out? She asked sharply. This is a time when I need kindness, I mumbled, closing my eyes to prevent my tears from spilling. I need my mother. If I could only go to her. I was surprised at my own words, yet I really meant them. Unable to hold back my tears any longer, I began to weep. Florinda laughed. She wasn't mocking me. There was a note of kindness, of sympathy in her laughter. You're so far away from your mother, she said softly, with a pensive, distant look in her eyes, that you'll never find her again. Her voice was but a soft whisper as she went on to say that the sorcerer's life builds impassable barriers around us. Sorcerers, she reminded me, don't find solace in the sympathy of others or in self-pity. You think that all my torment is caused by self-pity, don't you, Florinda? No, not just self-pity, but morbidity too. She put her arms around my shoulders and hugged me, as if I were a small child. Most women are damn morbid, you know, she murmured. You and I are among them. I didn't agree with her, yet I had no desire to contradict her. I was far too happy with her arms around me. In spite of my somber mood, I had to smile. Florinda, like all the other women in the sorcerer's world, lacked the facility to express maternal feelings. And although I liked to kiss and hug the people I loved, I couldn't bear to be in someone's arms for more than an instant. Florinda's embrace was not as warm and soothing as my mother's, but it was all I could hope to get. Then she went into the house. I came suddenly awake. For a moment, I simply lay there, on the ground at the foot of the fountain, trying to remember something Florinda had said before I fell asleep in the leaf-spotted sunlight. I had obviously slept for hours. Although the sky was still bright, the evening shadows had already stolen into the yard. I was about to look for Florinda in the house when an unearthly sounding laughter echoed across the yard. It was the same laughter I had heard during the night. I waited and listened. The silence around me was unsettling. Nothing chirped, nothing hummed, nothing moved. Yet, still as it was, I could sense noiseless footsteps, silent as shadows behind me. I wheeled around. At the far edge of the yard, almost concealed by the blooming bougainvillea, I saw somebody sitting on a wooden bench. Her back was turned to me, but I immediately recognized her. "Zulika," I whispered uncertainly, afraid that the sound of my voice might scare her away. "How happy I am to see you again," she said, beckoning me to sit beside her. Her deep, clear voice, vibrant with the briskness of the desert air, didn't seem to come from her body, but from far away. I wanted to embrace her, but I knew better. Zulika never liked to be touched. So I just sat beside her, and told her that I too was happy to see her again. But to my utter surprise, she clasped my hand in hers, a small, delicate hand. Her pale, copperish pink, beautiful face was oddly blank. All the life was concentrated in her incredible eyes, neither black nor brown, but strangely in between and oddly clear. She fixed them on me in a prolonged stare. "When did you get here?" I asked. "Just this moment," she replied, her lips curling into an angelic smile. "How did you get here? Did Florinda come with you?" "Oh, you know," she said vaguely. "Women sorcerers come and go unnoticed. Nobody pays attention to a woman, especially if she's old. Now, a beautiful young woman, on the other hand, attracts everybody's attention. That's why women sorcerers should always be disguised if they are handsome. If they are averagely homely, they have nothing to worry about." Zulika's sudden light tap on my shoulder jolted me. She clasped my hand again, as though to dispel my doubts, then gazed at me calmly and keenly and said, "To be in the sorcerer's world, one has to dream superbly." She looked away. An almost full moon hung over the distant mountains. Most people don't have the wits nor the size of spirit to dream. They cannot help but see the world as ordinary and repetitious. "And do you know why?" she asked, fixing me with her keen gaze. "Because if you don't fight to avoid it, the world is indeed ordinary and repetitious. Most people are so involved with themselves that they have become idiotic. Idiots have no desire to fight to avoid ordinariness and repetitiousness." Zulika rose from the bench and put on her sandals. She tied her shawl around her waist so her long skirt wouldn't drag, and walked to the middle of the patio. And I knew what she was going to do before she even started. She was going to spin. She was going to perform a dance in order to gather cosmic energy. Women sorcerers believe that by moving their bodies, they can get the strength necessary to dream. With a barely perceptible gesture of her chin, she motioned me to follow her and imitate her movements. She glided on the dark brown Mexican tiles and brown bricks that had been laid out in an ancient Toltec pattern by Isidoro Baltazar himself. A sorceric design binding generations of sorcerers and dreamers throughout the ages in webs of secrets and feats of power. A design into which he had put himself, around and inside it, with all his strength, all his intent, willing myth and dream into reality. Zulika moved with the certainty and agility of a young dancer. Her movements were simple, yet they required so much speed, balance, and concentration that they left me exhausted. With uncanny agility and swiftness, she spun around, away from me. For an instant, she vacillated amidst the shadows of the trees. as though to make sure I was following her. Then she headed toward the recessed, arched doorway built into the wall, encircling the grounds behind the house. She paused momentarily by the 2 citrus trees growing outside the walls, the ones that stood like 2 sentries on either side of the path leading to the small house across the chaparral. Afraid of losing sight of her, I dashed along the narrow, dark trail. Then, curious and eager, I followed her inside the house, all the way to the back room. Instead of turning on the light, she reached for an oil lamp hanging from one of the rafters. She lit it. The lamp cast a flickering glow all around us, but left the corners of the room in shadows. Kneeling in front of the only piece of furniture in the room, a wooden chest sitting under the window, she pulled out a mat and a blanket. "Lie down on your stomach," she said softly, spreading the mat on the tiled floor. I heaved a deep sigh and gave in to a pleasant sense of helplessness as I lay face down on the mat. A feeling of peace and well-being spread through my body. I felt her hands on my back. She wasn't massaging me, but tapping my back lightly. Although I had often been in the small house, I still didn't know how many rooms it had or how it was furnished. Florinda had once told me that the house was the center of their adventure. It was there, she said, where the old Nawal and his sorcerers wove their magic web. Like a spider's web, invisible and resilient, it held them when they plunged into the unknown, into the darkness and the light, as sorcerers do routinely. She had also said that the house was a symbol. The sorcerers of her group didn't have to be in the house or even in its vicinity when they plunged into the unknown through dreaming. Everywhere they went, they carried the feeling, the mood of the house in their hearts. And that feeling and mood, whatever they were for each of them, gave them the strength to face the everyday world with wonder and delight. Zulika's sharp tap on my shoulder startled me. "Turn on your back," she commanded. I did so. Her face, as she bent down, was radiant with energy and purpose. "Myths are dreams of extraordinary dreamers," she said. "You need a great deal of courage and concentration in order to maintain them. And above all, you need a great deal of imagination. You are living a myth that has been handed down to you for safekeeping." She spoke in a tone that was almost reverent. "You cannot be the recipient of this myth unless you are irreproachable. If you are not, the myth will simply move away from you." I opened my mouth to speak, to say that I understood all that, but I saw the hardness in her eyes. She was not there to have a dialogue with me. The repetitive sound of branches brushing against the wall outside died out and turned into a throb in the air, a pulsating sound that I felt rather than heard. I was on the verge of falling asleep when Zulika said that I should follow the commands of the repetitive dream I had had. "How did you know I've been having that dream?" I asked, alarmed, trying to sit up. "Don't you remember that we share one another's dreams?" she whispered, pushing me back onto the mat. "I'm the one who brings you dreams." "It was just a dream, Zulika." My voice trembled because I was seized by a desperate desire to weep. I knew it wasn't just a dream, but I wanted her to lie to me. Shaking her head, she looked at me. "No, it wasn't a dream," she said quietly. "It was a sorcerer's dream, a vision." "What should I do?" "Didn't the dream tell you what to do?" she asked in a challenging tone. "Didn't Florinda?" She watched me with an inscrutable expression on her face. Then she smiled, a shy, childlike smile. "You have to understand that you cannot run after Isidoro Baltazar. He's no longer in the world. There is nothing you can give him or do for him anymore. You cannot be attached to the Nawal as a person, but only as a mythical being." Her voice was soft yet commanding as she repeated that I was living a myth. The sorcerer's world is a mythical world separated from the everyday one by a mysterious barrier made out of dreams and commitments. Only if the Nawal is supported and upheld by his fellow dreamers can he lead them into other viable worlds from which he can entice the bird of freedom. Her words faded in the shadows of the room as she added that the support Isidoro Baltazar needed was dreaming energy, not worldly feelings and actions. After a long silence, she spoke again. "You have witnessed how the old Nawal, as well as Isidoro Baltazar, by their mere presence, affect whoever is around them, be it their fellow sorcerers or just bystanders, making them aware that the world is a mystery where nothing can be taken for granted under any circumstances." I nodded in agreement. For a long time, I had been at a loss to understand how Nawals could, by their mere presence, make such a difference. After careful observation, comparing opinions with others, and endless introspection, I concluded that their influence stemmed from their renunciation of worldly concerns. In our daily world, we also have examples of men and women who have left worldly concerns behind. We call them mystics, saints, religious people. But Nawals are neither mystics nor saints, and are certainly not religious men. Nawals are worldly men without a shred of worldly concerns. At a subliminal level, this contradiction has the most tremendous effect on whoever is around them. The minds of those who are around a Nawal can't grasp what is affecting them. Yet they feel the impact in their bodies as a strange anxiety, an urge to break loose, or as a sense of inadequacy, as if something transcendental is taking place somewhere else and they can't get to it. But the Nawal's built-in capacity to affect others doesn't only depend on their lack of worldly concerns or on the force of their personalities, but rather on the force of their unreproachable behavior. Nawals are unreproachful in their actions and feelings, regardless of the ambushes, worldly or otherworldly, placed on their interminable path. It isn't that Nawals follow a prescribed pattern of rules and regulations in order to have unreproachful behavior, for there are none. But rather, they use their imaginations for adopting or adapting to whatever it takes to make their actions fluid. For their deeds, Nawals, unlike average men, don't seek approval, respect, praise, or any kind of acknowledgement from anyone, including their fellow sorcerers. All they seek is their own sense of flawlessness, of innocence, of integrity. It is this that makes a Nawal's company addictive. One becomes dependent on his freedom as one would to a drug. To a Nawal, the world is always brand new. In his company, one begins to look at the world as if it had never happened before. That's because Nawals have broken the mirror of self-reflection, Zulika said, as if she had followed my train of thoughts. Nawals are able to see themselves in the mirror of fog, which reflects only the unknown. It is a mirror that no longer reflects our normal humanity, expressed in repetition, but reveals the face of infinity. Sorcerers believe that when the face of self-reflection and the face of infinity merge, a Nawal is totally ready to break the boundaries of reality and disappear as though he wasn't made of solid matter. Isidoro Baltazar had been ready for a long time. "He can't leave me behind," I cried out. "That would be too unfair." "It's downright foolish to think in terms of fairness and unfairness," Zulika said. In the sorcerer's world, there is only power. Didn't every one of us teach you that? "There are many things I learned," I conceded gloomily. After a few moments, I mumbled under my breath, "But they are not worth anything at the moment." "They are worth the most now," she contradicted me. "If you have learned one thing, it's that at the bleakest moments, warriors rally their power to carry on. A warrior doesn't succumb to despair." Nothing of what I've learned and experienced can alleviate my sadness and despair, I said softly. I've even tried the spiritual chants I learned from my nanny. Florinda laughed at me. She thinks I'm an idiot. Florinda is right, Zulika pronounced. Our magical world has nothing to do with chants and incantations, with rituals and bizarre behavior. Our magical world, which is a dream, is willed into being by the concentrated desire of those who participate in it. It is held intact at every moment by the sorcerer's tenacious wills, the same way the everyday world is held together by everybody's tenacious will. She stopped abruptly. She seemed to have caught herself in the middle of a thought that she didn't wish to express. Then she smiled. Making a humorous, helpless gesture, she added, "To dream our dream, you have to be dead." Does that mean I have to drop dead right here and now? I asked in a voice that was getting hoarse. You know that I am ready for that, at a drop of a hat. Zulika's face lit up, and she laughed, as though I had told the best of jokes. Seeing that I was serious as I could be, she hastened to clarify. No, to die means to cancel all your holdings, to drop everything you have, everything you are. That's nothing new, I said. I did that the moment I joined your world. Obviously you didn't. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in such a mess. If you have died the way the sorcerer demands, the way sorcery demands, you would feel no anguish now. What would I feel then? Duty, purpose. My anguish has nothing to do with my sense of purpose, I shouted. It's apart, independent. I am alive and feel sadness and love. How can I avoid that? You're not supposed to avoid it, Zulika clarified, but to overcome it. If warriors have nothing, they feel nothing. What kind of an empty world is that? I asked defiantly. Empty is the world of indulging, because indulging cuts off everything else except indulging. She gazed at me eagerly, as if expecting me to agree with her statement. So it's a lopsided world, boring, repetitious. For sorcerers, the antidote of indulging is dying. And they don't just think about it, they do it. A cold shiver went up my back. I swallowed and remained silent, looking at the splendid sight of the moon shining through the window. I really don't understand what you're saying, Zulika. You understand me perfectly well, she maintained. Your dream began when you met me. Now it's time for another dream. But this time, dream dead. Your error was to dream alive. What does that mean? I asked restlessly. Don't torment me with riddles. You yourself told me that only male sorcerers drive themselves nuts with riddles. You're doing the same to me now. Zulika's laughter echoed from wall to wall. It rustled like leaves pushed by the wind. To dream alive means to have hope. It means that you hold on to your dream for dear life. To dream dead means that you dream without hope. You dream without holding on to your dream. Not trusting myself to speak, all I could do was to nod. Florinda had told me that freedom is a total absence of concern about oneself. A lack of concern achieved when the imprisoned bulk of energy within ourselves is untied. She had said that this energy is released only when we can arrest the exalted conception we have of ourselves, of our importance. An importance we feel must not be violated or mocked. Zulika's voice was clear, but seemed to come from a great distance as she added, "The price of freedom is very high. Freedom can only be attained by dreaming without hope, by being willing to lose all, even the dream." For some of us, to dream without hope, to struggle with no goal in mind, is the only way to keep up with the bird of freedom. The end.